preliminary remarks from my side, and then I like to introduce the first speaker, which is Giuseppe Tambourello, who will give a presentation on words in poetry, early and late poems by Haizi. Giuseppa has a PhD in modern and contemporary Chinese literature and teaches at the University of Palermo. She does research mostly on short stories and poetry, and her latest monographic work is called When Poetry Makes Itself a Workers, China's Migrant Labor Poets. Since 2017, she's also teaching Chinese poetry to Chinese students at the Capital Normal University in Beijing and at Sichuan University in Chengdu. So please, Giuseppa, the floor is yours now.
So thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for pronouncing so nicely these Chinese names. It's a good first step, and many thanks to Josefa for having organized this wonderful and extremely inspiring conference. I'm extremely happy to be part of this. So thanks also to all the people who are listening, who are proposing their presentation. It's really very, 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 very stimulating. That's just one word I can use. I'll try to do my best in the time which is allowed. So I won't say much more and just get directly to share this screen, hopefully succeeding in that. And supposedly you can see it, right? Thank you very much for confirming. So this is Words in Poetry, Early and Late Poems by Haizi, as was just said before, correctly. And this is Haizi. You can see the two characters that form his name. Is pronounced like Haizi. And sometimes you can find it written in this in one of the two forms that you find in parentheses, either Haizi or Haizi. This is as foreigners, as people who are not Chinese. There is not always a kind of just one line in the way we deal with these Chinese names. In fact. Unless this is very clearly specified. But Haizi is a pseudonym of Cha Haisheng, and therefore, it can be written in one way or the other way when we use Latin letters. Hai, the first one, is the character for sea. According to the way you pronounce it, can also mean lake. And it has some resonance with the word Haizi for children, for child. And some scholars have been elaborating on this idea also. But I prefer the form, which is the second one that you see within the parentheses, as just one name, Haizi. He was born in Anhui province. And Anhui province, if you have an idea of China, with this big round belly towards the south, Anhui is just in this southern part of China. And he committed suicide practically when he was 25, if you just pay attention to the dates of his birth and of his death. And there are commentators that say that he was lying on the railway and waited until the train arrived. But according to what the conductor of the train has been declaring, in fact, he has been throwing himself under the train when the train arrived. So when we come to the idea that we can make choices, and also these little details allows us, to think about this possibility of having a choice. Because he passed away so early, and maybe you observed that it was in 1989, And it was in March, and shortly after, in June, but already during that spring, it was kind of, very lively. It was on preparation what later in June became known as the massacre of Tiananmen. So we are in a time when China is again undergoing some kind of upheavals. And because he died so early, there are, things which happen afterwards. As a matter of fact, he was born in a family of people working in the countryside, was never too rich. He always had problems with finances. But at the age of 15, he was admitted at the University of Peking. Showing therefore himself, or showing how good he was. And it was a kind of, very special child, admitted so early at the university. And also at this very young age, he soon could teach in the University of Peking. And but he had problems. He did not, he had some friends, of course, but he was not really a very social kind of young man. And it looks as if 4 of his love relationships that all gave him, a bad ending, might have been influencing his state of mind. In any case, no matter what, because he passed away so early, immediately after, there was a very, very broad reaction and reception of his works. Immediately after, between 1990 and 1997, 4 official books were published, whereas when he tried to publish as a young man, it was very difficult for him to find, magazines and publishing houses that actually wanted to publish him. And about him, also this thanatography tendency has been developing, which is, according to Michiel van Crevel, who wrote this article, Thanatography and the Poetic Voice Haizi, in 2008, is what is being produced after a young poet like Haizi dies, about why he died. What was in his poetry that could allow to imagine that he would be going to commit suicide. And in one way or the other, I especially would like to attract your attention to this domestication in words of something unspeakable, which is more or less what we all are trying to do today, to try to explain in an understandable way something which is actually quite, quite difficult to express. After Haizi passed away, died, in China, all this attention about him, and also due to the fact that in the same period, some other young poets also passed away because they all committed suicide, apart from Luo Yihe, who was a very good friend of Haizi, who eventually passed away because he got this brain hemorrhage. Some other poets like Gu Cheng and Ge Mai, they were committing suicide in this same period. And therefore, a myth was produced about these young poets, committing suicide. And at the same time, while this myth of, the death of the young poets was developing, shortly or sometime later, also another process of demythification was started that would kind of say, okay, he was a great poet, or was he a great poet? It was, kind of a different position taking place. But all this happened because he committed suicide. According to James Hillman, who wrote Suicide and the Soul in 1964, that very something that we have been listening about through the other presentation before mine, this something undefinable, this something that is there, is influencing, could be inside the person, could be around in society, produces this inner killer in his words. And all the work of Hillman has been focused on this analysis of the suffering of the soul. So how to deal with this suffering that a soul perceives and that tries to elaborate or does not try to elaborate, and to the end brings this soul to wanting to die. And again, the focus with James Hillman moves not just only considering the view of life, society, and mental health, which is all around us, but rather in this relation of death and the soul. What takes the soul to, in the end, wanting to die? And Hillman considered suicide not only as a way out of life, but also as a way of entry into death, as if something that the soul wants also to know, as if something to which the soul aims, not being happy or satisfied with what is already around there. And sorry, excuse me, are you still there? Whoops. Can you still hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I don't see the stamp before anymore. So since in the experience of death, the soul finds a regeneration, the suicidal impulse should not necessarily be conceived as a move against life, but as a meeting of the imperious need for a fuller life. So in this James Hillman way of approaching the concept of suicide, we see again another shift if compared to what we have been talking until now. Why did I choose this idea of working on the words? This is because I do base lots of my research work on Leo Spitzer's way of dealing with stylistic criticism. There is also resonance with something that has been said before. I think just in Geyer's presentation when she was referring to Freud and to deviations, because Leo Spitzer lives in this time when Freud is, kind of much spoken of, much presence on the scene. Leo Spitzer absorbs something from this, and he says that whenever we read a work of art, being this poetry or narrative or other forms as well, when we find something in these words that deviates from what our expectations are, well, then we should just pay attention to this deviation. This, of course, does not mean that the deviation is what was in the mind of the author, because the time changes, the people background changes also. Therefore, it's what we, as interpreters of this work of narrative or of poetry, perceive as a deviation. But this is not a limit, according to Leo Spitzer, because all different interpretations together give an even broader image of the work of art that, in a way, speaks by itself, in fact. And Haizi has been writing short poems, has been writing long poems, and I have been worked on a big volume, about which I'll tell you in a moment. And he has been, in this short span of time that was his life, he has been writing something like 2 million words. I've been making a brief calculation, like, you know, dividing 2 millions by the years of life that he has been writing, and he was writing between 1983 and 1989. The calculation brought to something like 700 words per day, something. So a kind of very active production and a very active engagement with poetry. Poetry was really fundamental for him. And if we take into consideration this time between 1983, when he started writing his first poems, until 1989, when he eventually passed away, we have a production that goes between 1983 and 1986, during which he writes short poems. There is a time when he writes long poems between 1984 and 1985. Then he resumes these short poems writing between 1987 and 1989. And the last poem that he composes is Sun, which will take 2 years to be written, but will not be completed in 1989. And it is composed, and what we have includes now 7 sections. I have taken this autograph page from this book. This is one of the books that were published. I don't know if you can see this, but probably yes. It's kind of thick book, which was one of those that, you know, followed to his death. And you see here this handwriting. And in this, and I have been considering poems which were included in this volume, that has been edited by Sichuan, another of the friends of Haizi, together with Luo Yihe, and they took care of editing his poems. And in the introduction, they split it in 2 parts. One was written by Luo Yihe and the other one by Sichuan. There are poems in this collection of complete works of Haizi that refer to artists and thinkers, but I did not take these into consideration, as well as I've not been taking into consideration a specific chapter of this book that is including dedications, but I will get back to this shortly later on. I did choose the early and the late poems because it is my feeling through the work that I've been done in the years with Chinese poets that in the early poems, in one way or the other, there is already a kind of synthesis of the production that will be produced then later on. Whereas the late poems are a kind of, you know, a synthesis to another further level that has been maturing through the years. If we observe the poems from the beginning of the production of Haizi, we will see that there is practically no punctuation, it's practically absent. Images are focusing mostly on the sea, on the waves, on water, boat, sun, room, spring in the exception of a season, but also youth, the village, considered as the village where one is born, flower, earth, bird, shoe, eyes, and wound. And the association that are created within these poems are with adjectives that are showing void, white, silent, black, unfamiliar, and broken. I'd like to point out about the fact that void is a concept of Buddhism in Chinese culture, and white is color for death, the emptiness of death. And in the poems of 1989, we have the appearance of a more articulated punctuation, as if he needs, you know, to organize the space on the page. And the images are bringing the attention to the grass field, to the world, the sea as ocean, so a much broader expanse is introduced, river, mountain, flowers again, snow, and whereas we had wounds in the very beginning, we have now blood. And the associations with unfamiliar, with black, with mysterious, monotonous this time, sullen, solitary, broken, they are there again. In 1984, he writes this Haizi on the sea, and the character of the sea is just, which is the same as his name, appears in the title. This is Chinese, as you can see, but I've been pointing out a few things in colors. Hopefully you can distinguish these colors, and you will see that the first line has a blue character of the sea. The same idea of liquidity gets back on the fourth line, where there are waves. There is this idea of liquidity with the characters on the last line of the first part of the poems with this boat, again in blue. And then on the first line of the second part, there is this other blue character that indicates a fish. Then in red, I have been indicating words. They are mostly adjectives that give an idea of negativity in a way. Qiongku on the second line is those fishermen that have no means, that are very poor. We have this banjo that on the third line gives the idea of clumsy. And then we have these last two characters like Wei Xiao in connection to the yellow part, which is the sun, which appears to be as fake. And then immediately down, we have these wooden axes that make the boat that are completely rotten. And next to the blue character of the boat on the last line of this first part, we find the guangzai, the red, and also specially indicated with strong characters, which is the coffin. And then, you know, other themes which appear are this, together with the sun that I've been indicating in yellow. There is also this other yellow next to the boat and the coffin, which is the room. Another, the topos of his poetry. And also this Qingchun on the second last line, again in yellow, which is spring. In the lines where an asterisk is, in blue, we have this concept in green of the yuanfang, of the distant place, you know, this distant place which is never specified in a more clear way, but it's, you know, a topos of the Chinese poetry, in fact. And also we have this shan shan, with these two characters at the very beginning that are shown in their double shape, which is something that is used in Chinese poetry to give rhythm. And it is followed by this falian, the dongxi, these things that irradiate light, but we don't know what these dongxi are. And we also have an unknown element in the third last line, where it says wu shi, wu chong, where we don't know where things begin and where they end. So just by pointing out that these elements in a poetry of 1984, when he was really very, very young, we already perceive a kind of atmosphere that is given by these words. And in Zunjuan of the same year, so the village where someone is born, which is, as you can see, very short, as it could be when it would be a traditional Chinese poetry, there is no punctuation whatsoever. And very rare was the punctuation also in the first poem. You can see so there is only one punctuation mark on the last line of the first part. Here we don't find any punctuation line, so it's just, you know, immediately given to the impression of the reader. And again, we have 2 times a repetition with a village. We have a repetition of these 3 words that come back together. Chin chinda, chin chinda. Then we have the paise, which I colored in red, which is the white color. The boat gets back in blue. And then there is a reference to my sister, younger sister, which is used again for the repetition and the rhythm then. In the book that I've taken into consideration, there are also drawings by Haizi, which immediately give this visual impression that is also typical of the Chinese characters. And it seems to me that these very essential lines draw a mother with a child. And in this, I find resonances with this maternal love that is one of the points that are recurring more often in this presentation of today as a kind of critical point. And then I have taken into consideration for you his first poem, published first poem of 1984, and the last poem of 1989. This is the way Ya Zhou Tong, this is the title, looks in the Chinese. And I have prepared a translation for you, so I'm sorry if it doesn't sound very beautiful. Maybe you can read it while I get back to some things which are in here. And so in red, you find these words that are connected to dying. So died, 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 to bury, drones, white, and then Qu Yuan with another white next to it. Qu Yuan is a poet, the poet hero, in fact, in the Chinese tradition. He was living 300 years before Christ, in the period when Chinese states, China was not unified yet, but it was composed, it was in fact a number of kingdoms which were fighting with each other. And Qu Yuan tries to tell his king that he is surrounded by people who cannot suggest him the best for the country. As a poet, an intellectual in China has always been feeling his task. And as a reply, he's being sent into exile. He can't stand this and will drown himself in the river. And the peasant in this village will throw rice balls in the river so that the fish can eat the rice and won't eat the body of Qu Yuan. Even today, there is a feast, the Dragon Boat Feast in China, that recalls this poet. So in the death of the poet, there is the assumption of a responsibility of the one who has to tell what is wrong. And by saying what is wrong, he receives wrong, right? And Qu Yuan appears in the first published poem by Haizi. And then we find again this sea, the river, the palms of the hands that, you know, the palms are where we can read also the future in a way, you know, what is unknown, the secrets of wild flowers. And then these birds, the grass, the pigeons, this metaphor with the shoes left by Qu Yuan on the river side that looks like pigeons that can fly over and bring messages, you know, even further away. And then this last sentence, this reference to drumming and dances that recall this nature of music and dancing of the most ancient Chinese poetry, this quality of music and dancing. And then this moon is mainly made up of you, that doesn't say much about what the meaning is, but that opens again these windows on the unknown. 春天是个孩子 is of 1989, just few days before he committed suicide. And the title is Spring 10 Haizi. So 10 Haizi. And we were just saying with Alison Parks just before that all ourselves are multiple. And then when this multiplicity takes room, then it's very difficult to reconnect all these different multiples, right? And in the title of the last poem by Haizi, we find 10 Haizi, not just one. And it goes without saying that many interpretations have been suggested by scholars about this title. And here again, I propose you.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. I don't know if our hands, maybe they are not visible. Because
no. The little square has disappeared, but I'm just finished. Allow me these 2 minutes. So I will show you again in the last poem. You can just read it by yourself, but you will see again that the reference to death is with the obsessed with death, and again there is the last question. When you talk about dawn, finally, what meaning does it have? So there are questions which have not been answered. So some final remarks. It has come also in the discussions before. This poet is a poet of a young age, and in an epoch of turmoil, there is this perception of a sense of solitude. This is one topic that maybe we need to, point out at. It could be important to get back to the role of the agricultural landscape in Haizi poems, as well as a reading should be done of influences that he has been having in his poetry, from Nietzsche, Hölderlin, and from symbolism. And then also what constitutes his style. I mean, does his poetry mean something for the development of Chinese poetry of today, besides the fact that it has become well known because of his death? And finally, to observe his poetry from this point of view of the cultural consumerism, because he has become very famous because he was, he was attracting the attention because of his death, and the books were selling very well at that time. The last bit is again an ink illustration by Haizi that recalls this use of ink and paper to writing Chinese character, where we see just one head, a very solitary image of a person that maybe very clearly metaphorizes his way of feeling during his life. So I think I'm finished. Am I within the time?
Thank you. I fear we have gone a bit over time, but I wasn't sure. You mentioned at some point that you couldn't see us anymore, so maybe you didn't see.
I clicked on something and then you disappeared, so I was a bit sorry. I'm sorry.
But thank you very much for this very nice presentation, especially the colored presentation of these Chinese characters. I don't. But if there is one very pressing question somebody wants to ask right away.
I have just one, but I'm gonna ask Giusy later.
Okay.
Anytime. Thank you.
It's about the using of punctuation, because I'm really curious about what can mean the fact of not using punctuation in his poems at the very beginning, and that later he started using punctuation more often and more articulated. But yeah, in order not to cause a delay, just if you have a very quick answer for me.
Yes. I can easily do that. I was referring to the nature of music and dancing of Chinese poetry in the very beginning of Chinese poetry. And therefore, everything was based on breathing. So the rhythm was given by the breathing that the words were creating, and therefore it was not necessary to use any punctuation. I mean, they had no punctuation. Punctuation is something that has come into Chinese poetry only very, well, I wouldn't say very recently, but recently, like, towards the end of the 19th century, really. when also the language became bisyllabic instead of just monosyllabic. And so one of the tendency of the poets nowadays, like, in Haizi or also in Duo, is to write verses that can exist on their own breathing rhythm. So where there is no need for punctuation anymore.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, AC.
Thank you very much for asking.
Thanks as well. And we will move on now to the next speaker of this panel. A presentation by Khyati Tripathi entitled Sarvat Hussain, His Poetry and Suicidal Jumps. Dr. Tripathi is an assistant professor in the School for Life at University of Petroleum and Energy Studies in India. She completed her PhD at the Department of Psychology at the University of Delhi. She was awarded the prestigious Commonwealth Split-Side Scholarship to spend a year of her PhD in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck University of London. And she has been a death scholar for 12 years. Her PhD thesis, focuses on the cultural construction of the dead in Hinduism and Judaism through culture-specific death rituals and mortuary techniques. And her work is based very much at the intersection of psychology, psychoanalysis, and social anthropology. She's moreover the review editor for Age Death, which is a part of the AgeNet, and she's also an active member of the Association for the Study of Death and Societies, as well as ASDS Ambassador for India since the year 2019. Please, Khyati, go ahead. 20 minutes. After 18 minutes, I will raise my hand again. And
Thank you, Thomas. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so good evening, everyone. And today I'm going to present very briefly on this research, on this paper that I'm working on for quite a bit time now, and I'm also writing a chapter for Giuseppa. So this presentation is titled as Sarvat Hussain, His Poetry and Suicidal Jumps. Why suicidal jumps? We'll get to know when we know about Sarvat. Could we please move on to the first slide? So let's try and know about Sarvat first. Who was Sarvat? About his life, his death, and his jumps. Who was Sarvat? Sarvat was an Urdu poet, born and brought up in Karachi, Pakistan. He was born on November 9th, 1949, and he died on September 9th, 1996, at the age of 47. He jumped in front of a train. Now, as we are in the process of knowing about Sarvat, I think it's also very important that I point out two conjunctures here. The first one, why am I calling these as conjunctures? Because, again, not conclusive, but we have been talking about that. The first one, that Sarvat was in love, hopelessly in love, with a famous poetess, and separation from this poetess, from his love, caused him a lot of despair, which he has expressed in a lot of his works. And the second conjuncture that I would like to point out here is, was it a suicide or an accident? This is a discussion that has been going on, but most scholars have written that this was a suicide because Sarvat attempted suicide in 1993. So 3 years before he committed suicide. So therefore, a lot of discussions around this suicide were happening, and most scholars say that this was a suicide and not an accident. So in this presentation, I am going to talk about what I am trying to do with Sarvat's works or with his poems, how I am looking at those poems. So I am trying to dissect Sarvat's poems and trying to look at what emotions and thoughts dominated his works, and if there is any association with the act of suicide or suicidal ideation. So I'm using thematic analysis and content analysis, of course, to look at themes through thematic analysis, and content analysis to see if there is really a family of words that Sarvat uses in his works. So through that, if there is an association between these words, so for example, death, suicide, if he has been using this family a lot, then what does it suggest? Next slide, please. Okay, but before we move on, one question, a pertinent question to ask here is, are words reflection of one's inner world? Why is that a pertinent question? Because as a researcher, I don't have the author alive to validate what I'm going to suggest by looking at his work. So are words really a reflection of one's inner world? So I will try and answer this question as a qualitative researcher, and we all know that as qualitative researchers, we do not conclude anything. Rather, we try and find out markers, we try and find out indicators, and we try and highlight certain aspects of, let's say, a participant's life, of an individual's life. So this is what I am also trying to do through his works. What do we do through these words? What do we do, for example, through interviews that we collect, through narratives that we collect? We try and create a space and pave a way into their subjective psychological world. Again, not to conclude anything, but to initiate maybe a meaning making process. What does it suggest? What this narrative suggests? What does this interview or these words suggest? And that's what I've been trying to do. Also, just to mention poetic inquiries, one such method in qualitative analysis where participants write poems reflecting on their experiences and then researchers interpret those. So we can, I think, as qualitative researchers, we can work with these texts and poems and they can act as powerful sources or powerful data sources. Next slide, please. So let's try now and delve into Sarvat's inner world and explore a possibility if I can find out something about what was going on at all. So what I'm trying to do here is I am looking at his poems and trying to bring out certain nuanced themes. Next slide, please. So let's look at these two couplets. So the first one, again Urdu and English translation. The first one is मौत के दरिंदे में एक कशिश तो है सरवत लोग कुछ भी कहें कहते हो खुद खुशी के बारे में खुद खुशी means suicide. So it says people might say anything about suicide, but there is some powerful attraction to death. The second couplet. जब दुनिया में हर शख्स के पास एक ना एक काम था मैं तुम्हें याद कर रहा था When everybody in the world was busy doing something, I was thinking of you. Now, what are certain significant aspects that we can deduce from these couplets? Number one, of course, evidently used words, suicide, death. Second, powerful attraction to death. It exemplifies a powerful temptation towards death. And third, I think that I would like to elaborate on, in a way, if you look at these two English translations, people might say anything about you, but I have something different to say. When everybody in the world was doing something, I was thinking of you. So what I'm trying to do here as an author, I'm trying to situate myself different from the majority. I'm trying to place myself away from the normal. So people might say anything about suicide, but I feel attracted towards it. When everybody in the world was doing something, I was thinking of you. So how I'm situating myself away from the normal is something I would elaborate on in the next slide too. Next slide, please. All right, so let's look at some of these poems by Sarvat and just the highlighted parts would do. So this poem, this highlighted part, here Sarvat writes, जब मैदान से एक बच्चे का जनाजा गुजर रहा था, मैं तुम्हें याद कर रहा था. When a death procession of a child was passing through, I was thinking of you. Very powerful, yet has been written in a very subtle way. Next slide, please. What do we understand through these two sentences? There is prevalence of death, of course. Evidently, Sarvat is talking about death. Whose death? Death of a child. Now, how is he talking about this death? He's not talking about how the child died, etc., but he's talking about a death procession. Whose? Of a child. Something that will grab your attention if you're witnessing it. But Sarvat makes it trivial in his poetry because he wants to write that even something as powerful as a death procession of a child couldn't switch me off. I was still thinking of you, and therefore I still am situating myself away from the normal. It's just something going on in my head. I am still thinking of you. Even death cannot switch me off. Next slide, please. Now, this poem is called Paperweight. Now, let me just give you a little context of this poem because Sarvat writes about a paperweight, a simple paperweight, and writes about it as if it's a planet and people reside on this planet. And how he concludes this poem. Sarvat writes, शायरी की आंख ने जिंदगी दी और मार दिया, meaning poetry gave this paperweight life and then killed it. Very interesting. Next slide, please. Now, what are the things that we can look at in these sentences and understand? First of all, through these, and I'm taking just two sentences from these poems and not the whole poem, just to give you a brief idea of how I'm trying to understand these poems and writings. So, first of all, ephemerality of life. How, through written words, Sarvat says, poetry gave this paperweight life and then killed it. So, ephemerality of life. Life was there, but for a very short duration. And then transition from life to death. Who was of an inanimate object? Now, this is very interesting. How Sarvat is constructing an inanimate object into a living object and then very smoothly creating a transition between life and death through the use of a few written words. So, ephemerality of life, transition from life to death, death of an inanimate, again, very, very significant. Next slide, please. The third poem, very interesting poem because here Sarvat writes about, he's writing about how wooden wheels of a cart are being carved. And let's look at the last two sentences again. गाड़ीवान आएगा और उसे ले जाएगा, गाड़ीवान आएगा और ये फूल ले जाएगा. The carter will come and take the wheels, the carter will come and take the ashes. Now, in the previous writings of poems, we were looking at death and visible death, evidently mentioned death. Now here, death has taken a latent form. The carter will come and take the wheels, the carter will come and take the ashes. Whose ashes? These could be just wooden shavings because wheels have been just carved. But does it really point out to those wooden shavings, or is it in a latent way also pointing out the bodily ashes? Again, the latent way of expressing death. Another slide, please. Next slide. So until now, in the previous writings, just that have been used as examples here, we were talking about visible death. Now, through this poem, we can also talk about latent death in Sarvat's writings. Next slide, please. Now, this is one poem, and I couldn't really find English words to translate the last two sentences because I just couldn't do justice to it through English words. So I will just give you the context to it. Here, Sarvat writes about intoxication and points out in the last two sentences that maybe intoxication would give him some hope. So here, Sarvat is trying to find a link between intoxication and hope. Now, why is this significant, intoxication and hope? Because intoxication, in a way, is Sarvat through intoxication is trying to find another territory where he could exist in a different way. And why an association between intoxication and hope? Because there is a lot of latent content on hopelessness in Sarvat's writings. So we come across hope and hopelessness and longing. So here Sarvat establishes the link between intoxication and longing for hope, that I will get some hope through intoxication. Next slide, please. Next. All right. So whatever works, Sarvat's works, I have read until now and I've tried to analyze, these are some pertinent themes that I've come across. The first one, hopelessness, right? The second one, as we just discussed, visible death and latent death. The third one, separation and longing. And I've not been able to explain it here, but separation and longing has been expressed in Sarvat's writing, mostly referring to the separation from his lover. The fourth one is yearning for a transcendental existence. So, in many writings, Sarvat talks about how he gets lost in the moment and how he just forgets that he's on this planet and how he exists somewhere else. Or he writes as if something is happening on this planet and something else is happening on another planet and he's cognizant of both. So there is this yearning for a transcendental existence. Again, we could also link it with how he situates himself sometimes away from the majority and situates himself as different. And lastly, recurring mention of a woman's body or nakedness, which I have not been able to explain through those examples. And this was bold during his times. So Sarvat has been writing about a naked body, a woman's naked body, and he would not write a poem on woman's body, rather just mention a few lines, let's say two sentences on woman's nakedness. Through his poem, he would just express it. So there is a recurring mention of woman's body and nakedness. Now, what am I going to do with these themes? Of course, there are certain themes that evidently point to death, for example, hopelessness, death, separation, etc. But the last one, for example, recurring mention of a woman's body and nakedness, how am I going to link it to death, or is there any link at all? So that is what I'm trying to do now, because I'm trying to now find sub-themes. So if there is a recurring mention, for example, of a woman's naked body, then what are the other examples or other themes running through the same poem? And how can I find a link between mention of a woman's naked body with, let's say, separation and longing, with, let's say, hopelessness? So that is what I'm trying to do. Next slide, please. Now, after this is done, I think the most difficult task for me right now is to create a chronology of Sarvat's emotions in conjunction with the chronology of his life events reflected through his work. Now, why is this difficult? Because there are two books that have been published. One was published back in 1987 and another was published posthumously in 1998. And Sarvat's works are not that freely available. So I'm trying to accumulate those works, but those works either have become a part of an edited collection which was published in some other year. So I'm trying to find out when that particular work was originally published and what am I going to do with that. I'm of course going to again create a chronology of his life events based on how his poetry or what emotions were dominating his poetry at that point in time. For example, in 1993, when Sarvat attempted suicide, what his works really tell us about his psychological subjective world in 1993. So what was going on? This is what I'm trying to work on. And I would be really happy if you could just give your suggestions and feedback on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Khyati. You have finished even a little earlier, which I think is no problem at all. Are there any questions, comments?
Did he express any jealousy towards the loved one as another negative emotion?
Yes, Sarvat has expressed some negative emotions, a lot of negative emotions actually. Sarvat, so when we look at where he expressed his separation and longing, he has expressed jealousy, for example, those who have something that he wanted. So yes, there are expressions of jealousy, there are expressions of separation and longing, and mostly he has expressed that in the context of his love affair. because his separation from his lover caused a lot of despair in him, and that is evident in his poetry. So yes, that's there.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Question from Giuseppa.
Yeah, thank you, Khyati. I was shocked by a sentence in your presentation, which said, people may say anything about suicide, but there is some powerful attraction to death. So I have in my mind the following reflection. It's not a reflection, but an impossible to answer question, I think. Why are we human beings so attracted to death, so interested in this phenomenon, especially when it takes place in an abnormal situation, in an abnormal manner? I think that we need to talk about death. We need to talk of death. Is for us doing this is for us a way to familiarize with something that is, as Yusi said in her presentation, is the unspeakable. I'm not sorry if I pronounce this word properly. Unspeakable. So I think we really have a necessity from an anthropological point of view to speak of death, to speak of suicide, just because it's a phenomenon so unknown for us, and we are afraid about this phenomenon all of our life, that we need to talk about it, just with the aim of introduce this horizon in our life, in our quotidianity. I don't know. What do you think about that? Why do we need to talk about death? Why are so we attracted to death?
Thanks for the question, Giuseppa. So there are both aspects to it. So, for example, there is this death movement, and we are trying to say that we should be talking about death, and death is not a taboo. And then, for example, I would take very specific example of my household, where we keep talking about death, and I think that's why I'm a death researcher or a death scholar, because we have been talking about death for the longest time. So why do we need to talk about that? I think I work a lot on from the perspective of autoethnography, and I think talking about death gives us that control, that uncertainty and unpredictability that is associated with the death takes away from us. So participating in rituals, participating in death rituals, in group rituals, gives us that control back. So while we are not able to in a way predict when it is going to happen, we try and communicate with it through these unspoken words. As Douglas Davis writes, words of death. So rituals become those words, and we communicate with death through rituals and certain other activities. And I'm just not talking about religious rituals. We could have our own individual specific rituals through which we try and gain control. So I think, yes, both aspects are true. Sometimes we want to talk about it, sometimes we just do not want to talk about it. And when that happens, when we don't want to talk about it, it becomes a spring phenomenon where we keep pressing it, and then at the end, we repress it so much, then at the end, we sort of defend ourselves so much from death that at the end, it causes certain manifestations in different ways. For example, it gets manifested, we feel sometimes anxious, we develop death anxiety, etc. So yeah, so that is how I understand it. And specifically, there are many ways to understand individually how we deal with it. So for example, as a death scholar, I deal with it. I think intellectualization is a defense mechanism that I use, where I have transitioned all my anxiety into written words and research. So I've been trying to know about it more. I've been trying to research more so that I'm able to know about it more. And that's again a defense mechanism, I guess. That's intellectualization. So there are individual ways of understanding it too. If that answers your question at all.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's another question by Alison Parks.
Yeah, I mean, this is less of a question, but I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the question that you opened with about the extent to which we can consider people's written work as a reflection of their interiority. And I think that it's a great place to start, especially for the poets, because one way in philosophy of sort of alleviating the tensions of death and pain and anguish is through transcending it, reflecting on the consciousness of the experience. So I think poetry is a really great way to do it. And I like the idea of these poems reflecting how life is ephemeral, because in a way, poetry itself is ephemeral. It exists in a fleeting moment, and it might get thrown away, or we might have scraps of it to retain for centuries. And we just, it's a way of clinging to something. I think the same way that we sort of cling to life, but recognizing its ephemeral nature makes it, I think, easier to think about death. So I think I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your presentation, because I think I also use the intellectualization of death as a coping mechanism.
Thank you so much.
So I guess there would be time for a very quick question if there is one. Yes, Giusy?
I'll try to be quick, as you were asking. I mean, if we get back to Leo Spitzer's theory, definitely the words used by an author are a representation of his vision of the world. So, and especially when we observe the deviations, what I was calling deviations, then we have something that says something about his style that makes that very author different from another one. And when it comes to talking to death, I think, or I don't know, I don't often speak about death, but perhaps people do that in order to exorcise that itself. And maybe you also been paying attention to a phenomenon that is kind of very common in these recent few years, that many patterns of skulls appear on T-shirt, and you will remember the amazing skull covered with diamonds of the name slips out of my mind, of this artist. I have it, but anyway, it's a beautiful skull, totally covered with diamonds. So maybe just to present this and to have these skulls on a T-shirt, on decorations and everything, is also a way to, which is something that young people, use very often, is perhaps something to intellectualize death, and in a way to get less scared from it. I don't know, we should just analyze another phenomenon. But it looks to me as a kind of exorcism of death itself.
Okay, if you don't want to comment on that, Khyati, then I guess we can.
I absolutely agree with Josie. Absolutely. And I also found a lot of similarity between your presentation and mine. When I was looking at your presentation, I was completely immersed, because the way you had highlighted, how, for example, sky, sea, and death, etc., these words have been used, and how you can understand these words and associate these words to author's life, the poet's life. I think it resonated with me so much, and certain things that you said, I sort of felt maybe there is some cultural uniformity also. Though you talked about a Chinese poet, I'm talking about an Urdu poet. But there is some sort of a uniformity, a common thread that runs through it. And if possible, we should try and explore it together if at all there is a possibility. Because I could gauge that when I was listening to your presentation. And it was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you very much for wanting to say that. Some time ago, I have been presenting a paper which was about commonalities in authors that I was kind of, putting on the background of their being all from the East. And then there was a comment that said, maybe this is not because it enters into the philosophical approach. I said, okay, all right, forget about this. But because you are talking from your country, and I was trying to mention someone from China, there is a background that is culturally very close. Or anyway, anyhow, that has been having very, very strong interaction. And well, I mean, it's just up to us to wanting to take that into consideration or not. Sure. Thank you very much, Lily, for wanting to say. It's really important to me. Thanks.
Thank you too.
Okay. Yeah, thanks from me as well for the lively discussion. And I think it's now time to move on to the next and last talk of this panel. And then we, as you know, we have an extra panel talk as well after that. I'd like to introduce the independent scholar Derya Agis, who will present on being suicidal after birth, recoveries of Brooke Shields in Down Came the Rain, Elif Şafak's Black Milk, and Fuani Marino's Wake Me Up in the Midnight from an ecolinguistic perspective, or from ecolinguistic perspectives, to be precise. Agis earned her BA in Italian language and literature from Ankara University. She attended a specialization course in translation studies at the University of Bari. And she got her MA in English linguistics from Hacettepe University. She earned her MS in social anthropology from Middle East Technical University. And she finally received her PhD in Italian language and literature from Ankara University's Social Sciences Institute. So please, Derya, we are looking forward to your talk.
Okay, I think you can see my presentation.
Yes.
Okay. Now I'm starting. The American actress Brooke Shields wrote an autobiographical novel on how she suffered from depression after giving birth to her daughter, Rowan, and how she recovered afterwards. It is titled Down Came the Rain and was published first in 2005. After this rain metaphor, the Mr. Poton and black milk metaphors were used by the Turkish author Elif Şafak in her novel titled Siyah, Black Milk in 2007. Additionally, later in 2019, the midnight metaphor was used in Svegliami and Mezzanotte, Wake Me Up in the Midnight, to depict the postpartum syndrome by the Italian author Fuani Marino, who attempted to commit suicide at the age of 32 in 2012. All these metaphors refer to the postpartum syndrome. In this study, the cultural reasons for the suicidal ideas of the authors from different cultures will be analyzed, and my analysis will focus on how positive thinking about nature and arts as a therapy strategy may help suicidal people recover from their negative mental states, underlining the ecolinguistic metaphors used in these three works. These metaphors will show that all the three authors recovered from depression with the following strategies. First, appreciating ecological events. Second, adopting animals. Third, noticing the beauty of plants. Fourth, respecting works of art. And fifth, eating healthy foods. About the authors, Brooke Christina Shields is an American actress who was born in 1965. She has 2 daughters. She has a BA in Romance Languages from Princeton University. And Elif Şafak was born in 1971. She lives in England. She has won several literary prizes. She has a PhD in political science, a master's in women's studies, and a BA in international relations, and she has offered courses in Turkey, the US, and the UK. She defends freedom of speech and women's rights. Fuani Marino was born in Italy in 1980. She studied psychology. She wrote an autobiography on her postpartum syndrome titled Svegliami and Mezzanotte, and another novel titled Il panorama alle spalle. She is a journalist. And about dawn came the rain. The rain is a metaphor for postpartum depression used by Brooke Shields. Dawn is also is indicating the sadness emotion, affliction, undesired motherhood, and outside force can be the causes of the postpartum syndrome. She referred to Dr. Rebarber, and he told her about baby blues. But postpartum depression differs from baby blues. She was afraid of using medicine. She talks about hormonal changes and uses a flight metaphor for expressing her emotions. The evidence of her depression were sleeping or concentration difficulties, lack of energy, unwillingness to eat adequately, and sadness. At the end of the book, Shields shares these numbers that are the suicidal lines in the US. Regarding Black Milk and Wake Me Up in the Midnight, Elif Şafak talks about metaphors. Baby blues is Poton's NIPU. Baby blues is a low-key emotional imbalance that may occur immediately after the child delivery. And postnatal psychosis is Poton's uncle. This is the most dangerous and alarming psychological transformation that a new mother can go through, according to her. And the postpartum depression is the Lord Poton, as he is very forceful. As the Lord of the Jinn, therefore Jinn, he is estimated to appear to 1 out of the 10 new mothers. Usually he pays his first visit within 4 to 6 weeks after the delivery. Regarding Fuani Marino's Wake Me Up in the Midnight, Marino expresses directly her search for a place to commit suicide. She follows her aunt. She throws herself while her aunt is washing herself. She chooses the 4th floor, and the gravity force is a metaphor for the desire to live, and a vertigo is also a metaphor for her indecision to kill herself. Then she fell down, but she was not dead. She's happy for this, in fact. Her aunt says, never think about it, never think about that. This is a threat for her before getting recovered into the hospital. The nurses were asking her if she had fallen or if she had thrown herself down, but not the reasons. Therefore, the reasons for suicide are important, and she uses the travel metaphor for her suicide. These are the reasons for postpartum depression for Brooke Shields. They can be physical, tiredness, lack of sleep, social, lack of supportive friends, litigation with the husband or the partner, and changes of circumstances. They can be psychological, genetic tendencies, or proneness to depression. And the reasons for her own depression are the following: last 5 years, divorce, remarriage, miscarriage, fertility treatments, the suicide of a close friend, passing of her father, address change, hard birth, husband's job in a different city. And the reasons for the postpartum depression for Elif Şafak are the following. Şafak talks about cultural values, the consideration of menstruation as dirt in the Islamic cultures, and the belief in jinns, therefore demons. She imagines that Fuzuli, the philosopher, has a younger sister called Firuze. She has blue eyes and curly blonde hair, referring to her belief in Western cultures. One morning, Firuze wakes up with a strange wetness between her legs and a red blood smeared upon her nightgown. Therefore, she started to menstruate during her adolescence. She's imagining this. Sobbing, she runs to her mother, but no sooner has she said a few words than she receives a whopping slap. She cannot read the Quran. Therefore, in the Islamic cultures, when women are menstruating, they cannot read Quran or they cannot pray. This is a cultural value. Accordingly, as nature is a mother, if we think about this metaphor, Firuze is in a foreign land even as she sits by the brazier with reality, according to Şafak. Then she needs fresh air. She stays there, inhaling the smell of the wild herbs carried by the wind from the valleys. Therefore, the importance of nature prevails. Firuze wants to be trained in the Quranic sciences, like her brother Fuzuli in Kerbela. Therefore, women and men should be equal in terms of religion. We see the religious feminism of Elif Şafak here. Her nanny was a woman with skin darker than ebony. She reminded the child marriage issue. She marries an old man to settle down in Istanbul. And Pearl, she refers to Pearl as Tatbak. She refers to the Intercultural Adoption Center in the 1950s, the Welcome House. She calls herself Miss Practical while she was living in Brussels. And she lists the causes of her depression: hormones, cultural beliefs, outsiders, and personal invention. And Fuani Marino's reasons for postpartum depression are as follows. She felt, first of all, herself in a fog that makes her mysterious and far away. And she committed suicide on July the 26th, 2012. She named her daughter Greta. Her reasons can be genetic and the outsiders. She refers to Jerome Kagan. And she also refers to Gering Gramberg as a therapist. She refers to cognitive therapies. Regarding the ecological elements in the works, Brooke married at a house by the ocean. She called her daughter Rowan because a huge red oak tree is called Rowan in an Irish legend. She talks about Christmas trees and decorations, but the rain metaphor is for sadness. Şafak and Marino refer to trees, flowers, and the sea. Şafak says birds chirping in an Australian rainforest seem like the perfect sleepless aid if you ask me. And she spent the day trailing shants. She talks about spices, a pinch of ginger in a huge pot of vegetable soup, the whiff of seaweed even, with when I am miles away from the shore, the odor of pickled juice on a store counter 5 blocks away. Of all the chants, there is one that makes my stomach turn and has me running in the opposite direction: coconut. Who would have ever guessed that Istanbul smells of coconuts? And Marino remembers that she couldn't spend the summer with her daughter and husband in August as she was in the hospital. But they all appreciate nature and they consider it as a recovery means. Brooke depicts Rowan's first birthday in the following manner regarding animals and suggesting the importance of animals as therapy animals. Our apartment to look like we are underwater. The theme of her party is Finding Nemo, and the place is filled with orange balloons and blue and orange fish lights. Besides, her bulldog is called Darla, and she was also at the party. She made her daughter dance by pressing on her toy that plays music. Darla made Brooke meet her husband in the gym on the Warner Bros. Lot. Therefore, animals are helpful. Şafak had 2 turtles, and she talks about Noah's Ark for referring to pairs. But spinsters aren't regarded as good, both for Marino and Şafak for cultural reasons. Then Şafak refers to the Turkish expression, the female bird builds the nest. However, she believes in equality. Therefore, hardship shouldn't be put on women. She refers to a stray cat as a guide for a practical lady. Firuze sleeps with chicken and hen in her imagination. Regarding Marino, her father bought her dogs, cats, birds, rabbits, chicken, etc. And she refers to the Witch of Oz and the character of Dorothy. She remembers the blue sky and the blue birds as signs for hope. Then she mentions that she had a cat. Then regarding the beauty of plants that serve as doctors. For Brooke, meal. They are meal. Green, she refers to green chilies and passing time in the room overlooking Central Park. Then one must try to communicate with plants. Şafak was vegan. She tried to be vegan. And she calls herself Miss Highbrow Cynic, who is following an alternative diet. She has a plate of organic spinach, organic zucchini, and some kind of mixed vegetables with saffron in front of her. She is a staunch vegetarian on the verge of turning vegan. She refers to the flower petunia. Besides, Marino tells that she had a red wooden house on the terrace, and it had a wall full of flowers. She wore dresses with flower designs, and her relatives had to peel off fruit for her. Regarding food, Şafak mentions, I relish hanging bamboo and wind chimes on the porch, growing begonias in cute little pots, pickling vegetables in the summer, making grapefruit marmalade. Therefore, food art is a therapy for the authors. Regarding the concept of healthy food, one must choose healthy nutrients to deal with her or his negative emotions. Marino wasn't eating enough as a child, but motherhood requires it. Besides, attractive tables can be used to combat against depression. All the authors respect works of art. Brooke Shields, she chose a name for her daughter after reading some works of art, in fact. Apparently, Robin Hood's sister was also named Rowan, and she was similarly altruistic. In addition, Rowan Mayfair, the heroine in Anne Rice's The Witching Hour, is one of my favorite characters in any book, she says. Then, Şafak mentions the importance of poetry. Besides, she says, fall goes by and the trees shed their first leaves, painting the entire campus in amber red and brown. She imagines nature. In the mornings, little Miss Practical does herself and I go jogging. One day on the way back, we stop by the library. We find Miss Highbrow Cynic sitting on herself again, hunched over an open book. She refers to Zelda Fitzgerald, Scott Fitzgerald's wife, accused of being mentally ill. She forces women to be strong, accordingly. Marino refers to the painting The Bad Mothers by Giovanni Segattini. And she mentions several works. La Bottega dei Suicidi di Patrice Leconte. Inside Out by Pixar as a cartoon. Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Sussurri e Grida, Ingrid Bergman's film. Nosferatu, Baudelaire's La Fanfarlo, and The Darkness of Day by J. Rosenblatt. Then all emphasized the importance of eating healthy food. Şafak has different characters in her autobiography. Little Miss Practical, Dame Dervish, Mila the Ambitious Chekhovian, Miss Highbrow Cynic, Sexy Bluebell Bowery, and Nurturing Mama Rice Pudding. She uses the ice cream metaphor. My self-confidence has become a scoop of ice cream melting fast under the duress of motherhood. Then her daughter is called Shehrazad, and she refers to Sylvia Plath and Emmanuel Levinas regarding ethics. Depression can occur both in the East and the West, according to her. Brooke Shields prefers staying at home and cooking in the weekends afterwards. She cooks omelets, whole wheat pancakes, and chicken with green chilies on video nights. Regarding Marino, she had no appetite as a baby, unwillingness to drink artificial milk, and during primary school, she used to drink carrot juice and she would eat apples. She knew Christian prayers such as Ave Maria and Padre Nostro. Her father was Furio, her mother was Anita, and her name comes from their names. When she was 16 years old, her father dies as he smoked. Her first book was On Frank's Dairy. During the Christmas Eve, they ate pasta di pizza. They listened to Bach, and when she was 12, she menstruated and she calls it the Marquise. Therefore, women shouldn't be considered dirty when they start to menstruate accordingly. She had piercings and flirts with other girls' boyfriends. She wasn't a nice girl according to her. Her father calls her La Bambina, the child, and buys her dresses with flower designs. She refers to Sylvia Plath, Primo Levi, Emile Durkheim, and she mentions the importance of sweet breakfast and grape juice and the importance of socialization while eating. She starts to write articles on contemporary art, in fact. She met her husband, Ricardo, who brought her and still brings her to restaurants, in fact. For Şafak, she mentions Helen Sisu as a scholar, essayist, and literary critic. She analyzes the Freudian approach that sees women as lack, replacing it woman as excess. She describes women's writing by using metaphors of childbirth, breastfeeding, and allusions to the female body for her. When we refer to Sisu, she said the following, mentioning that women raise men. Men have committed the greatest crime against women. They have led them to hate women, to be their own enemies, to be the executants of their virile needs. Therefore, women should be friends with other women, in fact. To conclude, writing is a therapy for all the authors, all the three authors. Women mustn't be ashamed of speaking about hormonal imbalances, and the society must respect women's bodily changes. Women mustn't be discriminated, and art therapy shall teach society that women can have hormonal changes, and this is normal. Preventive measures shall be taken against excessive emotions felt during these hormonal imbalances. Besides, regarding ecolinguistic metaphors, we encounter the following regarding the framing of all the three autobiographies. Nature is a shelter against depression. Food is health, and a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Nature is a psychiatrist. Nature is a mother. Nature is cure. Nature is medicine. Animals are friends. Flowers are treasures. Plants are nurses. Therefore, one must learn the lessons expressed in works of art, such as literary works, paintings, and also gastronomical arts. These are the suggested research to read regarding art therapies by Perry et al. And Hogan et al. And then I thank you for listening to my presentation.
Yes, and we thank you for giving this nice presentation, and I want to immediately open the presentation up for discussion, for questions, comments.
I didn't see the difference between postpartum depression and baby blues. Can you explain a little bit more about this difference? between
Baby
the
blues.
two states.
Baby blues is a low state of depression, not sadness. It can be regarded as sadness, as explained by Şafak. Hopelessness may be a period of indecision after giving birth to a child. However, the postpartum depression is a severe case where the patient should refer to a psychiatrist.
I see. I understand.
As
Thank
the
you.
person can try to hurt herself or the baby.
Okay, thank you. I see the point.
You're welcome.
Giusy, please.
Yes, this is just a curiosity out of the blue, really, because you've been researching on Marino, the Italian writer, and she's very successful at the moment. I mean, like a couple of years ago in Italy. Do you think that because she's Italian, the fact that good food as a meaning for eco-linguistics or eco-criticism, that this has any special, possibility of development in theory? The fact that she's Italian and bound to good food or something like that?
Maybe. As for the socialization, the Italian food can be important as Italians eat within the family with the family members or friends. So the food can be eaten with the family members and reducing the depression. During the socialization period, it can be important besides different Mediterranean foods. Vegetables can be important for her culturally.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. May I just ask, because I don't know much, or should I say I don't know anything about ecolinguistics, those, what to call them? Those, I say slogans that you had at the end, food, nature is shelter, and so on.
Yes.
They reminded me very much. I don't know if you have also used this. I think it's called conceptual metaphors in metaphor theory, like something like high is good, low is bad, and such. Are these things somehow comparable?
Yes, the theory developed from that theory, the conceptual metaphor theory developed by Lakoff and Johnson. In fact, therefore, instead of conceptual metaphors, therefore the source frame and the target domain, there are frameworks, event frames, such as Aristotle mentions that climate change is a time bomb, and instead of constructing a conceptual metaphor, he constructs an ecolinguistic metaphor through frames. What can climate change cause as a bump? Things like that. He builds a picture. For instance, there are participants in that frame, such as deserts, destroyed gardens, destroyed houses due to the lack of water, things like that. He imagines this within a frame.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.